and welcome to the second episode of the Unredacted and the Black Sheep's special series on religion. I am Nikita, the co founder of the Unredacted project. This series is an attempt to initiate a public dialogue on religion to see what it means to us personally versus how it manifests in public policy, the law, politics, and so on. Today, we have with us a very special guest. We have with us Mr. Alok Prasanna Kumar. He is the co founder and the lead of Vidhi Karnataka. His primary areas of research are judicial reforms, constitutional law, urban development, and so on. He's a lawyer who graduated from Nalsar University and then went on to get his BCL from Oxford. So, welcome to the podcast, Mr. Alok.
My pleasure to be here, Nikita.
So, today we're talking about the Uniform Civil Code. It's an issue that routinely garners headlines every time the Supreme Court, let's say, decides a matter on personal laws, or for instance, gets revived by the present regime. I want to start by asking you, what is the UCC and what does it seek to do?
Good question. I'd also like to know. No, the reason why I say that, the serious reason why I say that, is that nobody seems to have an idea. If you look through the Constituent Assembly debates, when they said Uniform Civil Code, most of the members also had no idea what they were talking about. It seems to change depending on what question is asked of it. You'll find during the discussion, there's no clarity on what they mean by Uniform Civil Code. And at the end of the day, when Article 44 was put in, what Dr. Ambedkar clarified was that, listen, having a unified law is not a bad thing necessarily, but it need not necessarily be imposed. So his idea of a uniform civil code was possibly something that was already partially enforced, and we possibly already have it enforced. If you take the Special Marriage Act, which is applicable to people across religions, again out of choice, and then it follows up with consequences under the Indian Succession Act. There is already we also have a Juvenile Justice Act, which has provisions relating to adoption. So you have multiple legislation which deal with family law, or what we would call personal laws, in a secular way, which is not linked in any particular way to religion. But nobody, and absolutely nobody, has been able to clarify what is the content of a uniform civil code. I recently put out a LinkedIn post because I saw somebody else had filed another petition in the Supreme Court saying, and this is the bizarre stupidity of it, right? It's not like this person has an idea of what the Uniform Civil Code is, the one who's filing this. He is saying that the Supreme Court should, in the national interest, set up a judicial committee to figure out what a Uniform Civil Code should be and then ask the government to draft it. This is extraordinary stupidity, right? If you don't know what the law is going to say, how are you sure it's a good thing? In a sense that the only value this law seems to possess is uniformity. Great. What does that uniformity mean? Because let's start with something which is the most basic and which is pretty much always cited in the context of Uniform Civil Code, which is marriage. Now, those of us who have studied family law in law school will know that marriage, as far as Islam is concerned, is purely a matter of contract. And if you actually compare your concepts in contract law to concepts of marriage and divorce in Islamic law, it is very clear that the two match. You have the whole procedure in the context of Islamic law is about offer, acceptance, consideration, and and of course the way in which divorce happens is mutual termination of the contract. Contracts can be terminated unilaterally as a principle of law. We understand it, and everywhere around the world is accepted. So the whole idea of marriage is considered a contract. In Hindu law, it is considered a sacrament. It is supposed to be a holy bond between a man and a woman, which indicates the fact that they are going to be together for the rest of their particular natural lives. It is also the way in which the whole marriage ceremony happens. When you either go around, which is why you have, which is the sacramental meaning of going around the fire or tying the thali or whatever it is. Right? You can, of course, have a feminist critique of all of this, which is fine. But if you get to the fundamental core of the idea, the core of the idea is marriage is a sacrament. The idea of a divorce in Hindu law only had to be introduced by means of a provision in secular law, which is to say, we will allow for divorce with this condition. So there's no concept of a no-cause divorce. There's no question of a termination of a contract here, because you have to show good reason why you're terminating the sacramental arrangement. Likewise, Christian marriage, right? It's also considered a sacrament. Even there, divorce had to be done by an act of parliament in the UK, if you recall. And there was a split in Christianity over whether divorce was allowed or not. So there also the concept has evolved over a period of time. And likewise, it has evolved in India over a period of time. But you're talking about fundamentally different conceptions of marriage and divorce. Likewise, adoption, right? Second big issue. And I'll take the third issue to point out the fundamental philosophical difference. The second issue is adoption. Under Hindu law, adoption is not for the purpose of, oh, we are taking a poor child in and giving him or her the status of our child. You need to have someone to perform your funerary rites, right? You need to have someone to, either put you in the ground or set thing on fire. That was the purpose of adoption. You could adopt an adult male if you wanted. You could even adopt after your widow could even adopt after your death, so that they would perform the rituals that happen post your death for the next year or so. So there is no question of adoption as being a way to have a child, but adoption as one small part of it. The larger part of it was adoption was to have an heir who would perform the religious practices and inherit your rights. And that was the important thing. It fulfilled. And so you couldn't generally adopt a female child because the thing would only go to the male child. So I'm simplifying. There's a lot of complexity about this. But at the core of it was the religious idea. You need to have a male heir to literally light your fire. That was the concept of adoption. Whereas that concept does not exist in other religious laws. Right? It's completely different there. In fact, Islamic law doesn't have a concept of adoption. Because what is adoption? Adoption at the end of the day is the creation of a legal fiction, where you say instead of a natural born child, some other child is adopted and given the status of a natural born child and given the rights that a child would enjoy as such. It's a legal fiction. The third is property. Again, the notion of property. What is the religious philosophical basis for the notion of the Hindu scheme of Koparsari property, which is that as a joint family, you eat together, you pray together, you own the property. All of these three things go together, and that is fundamental to the Hindu idea of a joint family. It's not just a bunch of people who decide to live together. That is not the idea behind it. The idea is that you are a family which eats together, prays together, and therefore owns this property together. And the right to sort of have a share in that property is the moment a male child, in the past and now female child, thanks to legal amendments, that was at the moment of birth. Whereas there is no such concept in Christian or Islamic law. There it is property only proceeds to someone upon the death of the person who owns the property. There's no question of a share the moment you're born in a father's property and so on and so on. So when you're talking about uniformity, here's the key question. Are you replacing one with the other? Are you saying now everybody is going to follow the sacramental idea of a marriage? Is the idea of marriage going to be sacramental for everyone across the board? Are you going to say it is contract across the board? Or is it going to create some brand new third system which says all of this is rubbish, contract, sacrament, all of this is nonsense? They're going to say a marriage is a state-sanctioned arrangement between a man and a woman. Right. Is that your idea? I'm genuinely asking because I don't know. All the proponents of UCC have no idea what the philosophical basis or the religious or even the religious basis of all of these are. They're very confident that they have some magical understanding, which makes, if it means uniform, it means just like this. Let's also keep in mind that any choice you make is going to piss off people. Yeah. Any choice you make about this is going to upset people, and it is going to be most controversial, not about marriage and divorce, about property. Right. Because if you have to say, and here is where, marriage also, there's a secondary issue with the marriage, but anyway, I'll come to both of them. With property, if you say tomorrow that the Hindu undivided family is going to be applied to everyone across the board, keep in mind that if you convert, you lose your share in the Hindu right. to a right in the Hindu joint family because you're no longer part of the joint family. So now you'll have to set the clock back and say, irrespective of who converts and who doesn't, they have to get that. And that's another problem, another can of worms. Or I'm now going to say that now we're going to make all Muslims follow the Hindu undivided family concept, ignoring their religious. We're essentially making Muslims and Christians follow Hindu law. Right. For what? For what joy? For what purpose? What is the great benefit of the uniformity here, right? So, or are you saying more controversially that bye-bye concept of Hindu undivided family, which means about 500 million people in this country will suddenly lose a property right,
Right.
right? And I'm talking about people whose inherit. I mean, 500 million is a rough estimation, but it's in the order of hundreds of millions. Assume that, right?
Yeah.
People who thought they had a share in their father's property, ancestral property, will suddenly wake up and realize, oh, I don't have anything now because I have to wait for whoever owns that property to die. I can't claim partition. I can't claim meets and bounds. I can't claim any of that. So, yeah, that number of people suddenly lose that right to property. Do you think that's going to fly? Absolutely not. People have made business arrangements, family arrangements, farming arrangements, so many things, keeping in mind this particular thing. So if you're not going to abolish it in any way, then this idea is a non-starter. What is the question of uniformity? The basis on which the ownership of property is determined is something that is so fundamentally linked to particular religious ideas. How is it even going to fly? Simply not happening. A second bigger thing, and this is what nobody has seriously thought about, is what will be the uniform basis for validity of a marriage? What are you going to say is the basis for which the state will recognize marriage between A and B? Because here's what people who sort of talk about UCC a lot just don't seem to realize at all. For hundreds and hundreds, for thousands of years, the state wasn't involved or even interested in how we got married.
Right.
Right? As long as it didn't cause some violence, right? The only time the state got intervened was when there was an intercaste and interreligious marriage,
Right.
more likely the formal and the latter. There's a fascinating story in this biography about Shah Jahan, where a gay relationship came up before Shah Jahan for adjudication, not because they were in a gay relationship, but because they were of different castes. That was the problem, not the fact that these were two men in a relationship, but the fact that they were from different castes. That was unconscionable.
Yeah.
So in that sense, and we can multiply the examples. Historically, at least in India, I'm talking specifically about India, nobody's been interested how you got married, right? It's only been are you keeping the society and your family happy? That's fine. That's all that matters. Unless there is a quote, as we call it, a law and order issue, state never intervened in this. With one exception, the exception being there was an office under the Mughal rulers which delineated all the high caste Muslims and whom they could marry.
Right.
I'm forgetting the exact title. I can maybe share it with you later. But this in the sense that as there was a class system within among the Muslims, with the Sayyids and the Pathans considered literally the Brahmins among the Muslims and the other castes not so much.
Right.
So when the state has generally been uninterested in this process, and the only reason that the British even got involved in the process was because the cases were coming to their courts, right? There were cases of property, there were cases of zamindars, all of which are coming to court. They were struggling and trying to figure out how to make sense of Hindu law, Mohammedan law, Parsi law, and of course Christian law they enacted and codified, which wasn't so much of a hassle and an issue for them.
Right.
They were, except for some social reform measures that they took in the 19th century, such as banning some forms of child marriage, ensuring that Muslim women and Hindu women retained certain rights in the context of divorce and so on. They weren't particularly interested in reform, or they weren't particularly interested. They never mandated that for a marriage to be a marriage, you have to come and register it with us. Or they never tried to say, even the British, right, after 1947, they never tried to say that a marriage is a marriage only if we say it's a marriage. Even if you look at the post-independence laws, which is your Hindu Marriage Act, it doesn't, it simply reiterates under Hindu law, a marriage is a marriage if it is done in accordance with your customs. It doesn't say, whatever, upper caste should follow this customs, people of this caste should follow this custom, people should follow this caste, this custom. Burdens on you to show that this is what you guys used to practice and you've done it in accordance with that. All the state has provided for is an alternate that if you don't want to do it in accordance with this, here is how you can register your marriage, and we will still recognize it as long as you follow that other procedure, right? But doesn't mean that only if you follow this procedure is a marriage recognized. That's the thing. The state mandated procedure, because you're still saying custom, and that's true across religions.
Right.
It's true across religions. It is not something that the state is trying to regulate what is a valid marriage beyond prescribing age limits and consent. That's it. So in that context, what is a UCC trying to do? I don't know. And I go back to the first question that you asked. What is the UCC trying to do here? What is the content of the UCC? You say quote unquote uniform, but we don't know what is uniform about this. Because the very real danger when you say uniform is you're going to create the equivalent of an NRC for women, married women in this country. If you're going to say that everyone has to get their marriage registered in this country, we're talking about the most vulnerable section of the population of this country, which is married women who don't have access to their own assets, who don't have access to their own incomes. Suddenly finding that the one source of relationship which allowed for them for their sustenance is suddenly dependent on the whims of the local registrar believing them or not.
Oh,
Right?
right.
And how are they going to do it? They may have access to some education, but they think that most of India's women don't live in their parents' house or even in the same village as their parents, right? They are essentially cut off from access. They're cut off, not given the recent labor force participation rates. Not too many of them are working also. They don't have independence. Sure, maybe a certain percentage of them will be able to prove and show that, yes, I'm validly married to such and such. And maybe if they're lucky, they will have husbands who are interested in also showing that, yes, I'm married to such and such. But for the vast majority of women, you're suddenly deprived them of the source of legitimacy that they thought that they had in their status as a married woman. So UCC can't possibly present. And this is why no state has ever thought, in India at least, no Indian state, although there is like, we should ensure all marriages are registered. No state has said that a marriage will be invalid if you don't register it.
Right.
You may impose a penalty. You may say, fine, we'll ask you for 1,000 rupees, or we won't recognize, or you won't get a passport if you don't show this kind of stuff. But nobody has said that it's not a valid marriage if you don't come and register with us in this business way. Even the provisions under the Hindu Marriage Act for registration are purely voluntary. The only this thing is if you choose to get it voluntary, again, if you choose to get married under the Special Marriage Act, only then do you have to register it. So in that context, what is the UCC trying to do? Nobody has been able to give this answer. Nobody has offered anything like a clear understanding as to what is the purpose of the UCC. There is no content to the law. There are 7 questions which I listed out. If people want to check out, it's on my LinkedIn page. But nobody has sort of told us what will be the criteria for validity of a marriage, what will be the basis for inheritance of property, what will be the consequences for someone who converts out of a religion. Multiple sets. All of it is vague. All of it is in the air. Nobody has actually sat down, drafted a UCC to even see, and which is why the government asked the Law Commission to do it, and the Law Commission said, "Oops, I don't think it's happening."
Right.
Nobody said, and every time the Supreme Court says this, I dare any Supreme Court judge who has sort of put for a UCC in their judgment, right? Who said UCC is great, UCC is great. Most of them are now retired. They have nothing better to do in their lives anyway. They should put out a draft of a UCC which they thought was so fantastic and wonderful that they decided in their judgment that it should be done.
Right.
You clearly have an idea of what the UCC is. Enlighten all of us. Please enlighten all of us. What was this wonderful thing that you thought you should talk about endlessly in your judgment as so wonderful for this country? All of them. Any one of them. Put out a draft. I dare you to put out a draft to say what this UCC looks like. Because for me, unless I know what I'm looking at as a UCC, I won't know if it is in fact a uniform code. I won't know if it is in fact constitutional or not. And I won't know what are the benefits it professes to offer. So what are we debating when we call something a UCC? If people talk about it as if it is so obvious, it's just a trivial task of putting some apology. It's not. So I'd say, to go back to your first question, please somebody show me a draft UCC, then I'll tell you what UCC.
Right. So Alok, on this point, I want to ask you. So the Bharatiya Janata Party, right? Since 1998, the UCC has been a part of their agenda. The Jan Sangh spoke about it, then it featured in their election manifesto ever since. Even in 2014, it featured in their manifesto. It was in top 3. The first was the Ram Temple, the second was the revocation of Article 370, and the third most poignant, long-standing issue has been the UCC. So I want to ask you, what would be your take on this? What is this obsession with the UCC? What explains it? Because if in the real sense, if we set aside the NDA's fantasy of what the UCC is and what an actual UCC could look like, which would be neutral, which would look like, let's say, the Indian Succession Act, so on and so forth, then wouldn't that erode Hindu laws alongside Muslim laws, alongside Christian laws? So what explains this obsession with the UCC?
I'm not a scholar on modern day Hindutva. Let me clarify that. There are better people than me who are researching and writing this. But what is fundamentally at issue, I think, is that the UCC is always brought up in the context of Muslims. It's never about UCC will solve some issue for Hindus or Christians. It never is. It's assumed we have some perfect idea of Hindu law in the context, and they're not. The Hindu code has its problems. I think there are much more things which can be reformed in that context. But it's always brought up in the context of Muslims. And I don't want to psychoanalyze, but it seems like there is some deep and bitter resentment that how is it that Muslims are allowed to have 4 wives and we are technically not? And I say we, I mean exclusively almost Hindu men. The fun fact is, according to the Indian National Census itself, the rate of polygamy among Hindus is higher than Muslims.
Yeah.
The only difference is that polygamy among, first, of course, those who married before 1956
Right.
not affected. Second, of course, it is dependent on the people who marry to actually make the complaint. So there are many people who have happily cohabited with more than one wife with the full consent of both partners and moving on, right? Nobody per se stops them. Nobody per se. The issue always comes in when it comes to the children. And a lot of our jurisprudence in family law has been driven because somebody has said, hey, what? You had a first wife? Since when? Or what? I'm the child of the second wife? Who knew? Stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
So in that context, that's what tends to happen. Which is where I mean, it just seems to be driven by some kind of resentment. And my point is simple: if that's the source of resentment, it takes a simple amendment to the Sharia Act of 1940, which governs Islamic law. Oh, not doesn't govern Islamic law, but simply says that what will be applied to Muslims in India is the Sharia law. By the way, since I mentioned that, like we have the Hindu code, this law is also the sort of kind of like Islamic code for Muslims in India, because prior to this, there were enough Muslim communities in India which actually followed Hindu law. The Bohras, for instance, in the context of succession, not lots of communities in the northwest frontier province, but now is in Pakistan, and several smaller communities here and there. They actually followed parts of Hindu law because they were like, this works for us better. This is a much more easier way for us to handle our affairs in a lot of these things. Although they might marry in accordance with the Islamic stuff. So, but they would still, for the purposes of inheritance and all of that, follow Hindu law. They were all now compelled to follow Islamic law, and there was resistance to this. Bohras and others and Pathans, and so the government had to make it sort of voluntary also. So people would come up and declare that I will now follow Quranic law for the Sharia for the purposes of this thing, and therefore arrangements can be made accordingly. So it won't be applied until you make that. So this is all in there in the Constituent Assembly debates. Ambedkar goes in depth into it. He actually answers some of the points made by the Muslim scholars who say, no, UCC is very bad idea, don't put it in the Constitution. He says, look, none of this is mandatory, first of all. Second of all, you guys have yourselves had an experience of what a uniform civil code looks like for your own community, where a number of diverse practices were put together. And his point, of course, while answering that, is also that he has in mind the Hindu code. Keep in mind, the Hindu code was still an idea at that time. It was the reason why Ambedkar quit Nehru's cabinet. And this was only eventually passed in a much more diluted form after he passed away in 55 and 56, against massive pressure from the Hindu community. If you read about this, there's a fantastic book called Debating Patriarchy by Anuja. I want to say, I can't remember the second name. It's called Debating Patriarchy.
Yeah.
Sure. Which actually talks about the kind of issues that happened when this draft code was put out and how women responded. How women responded saying, this is why we need. This is why we need it. This is why it's such a big issue. This is why we want this reform, and it should go through whether or not the big patriarchs of the Hindu religion want it or not. So, and keep in mind, even as recently as 1905 or so, when the great scholar Henry Maine was writing about Hindu law in his great commentaries, Maine's Hindu law. If people who have access to it in the law school library should look up the older editions, which carries the preface written by Henry Maine. Even as late as 1905, he's saying Hindu law is just too complex. It can never be codified. Right? It'll always be this massive mishmash and jumble of not only shastras and smritis and srutis and all of that, but also the judgments of the book. So it's technically Anglo-Hindu law, like how Muslim law is Anglo-Mohammedan law. It is Muslim Sharia law as applied by English judges through the common law system.
Right.
Likewise, Hindu law is Anglo-Hindu. It is the Shastric Hindu law as applied by English judges through the common law system. Right. So in that sense, that's what has gotten codified, eventually modified in certain ways to become what we now call the Hindu code. And even then, even as late as 2022, we are finding, I don't know, just a few days before this podcast is recorded, there was a case recently of the Supreme Court of India which related to pre-1956 family arrangement, where they had to go back and look at Shastric Hindu law to see what was the consequence of this woman inheriting her property from her father, whose brother had predeceased, and she didn't marry. So what happens to that property? I mean, it's always going to be that way. It's always going to be a complicated mix. But the fact is that nobody comes at it from we should make the law simpler, easier to understand, more equal. It's assumed a quote unquote uniform law is by definition equal, but it's not. Unless you show me what that law looks like, I won't know if it is equal or not. So in that context, there is much to be reformed about Hindu law. There is much to be reformed about Islamic law. There is much to be reformed about Christian law and maybe Parsi law and whatever else it is. But none of that is the part of the discussion. It's to me, it feels almost as if this obsession with UCC is to deflect attention from the parts of Hindu law which need amendment. The last major change which took place was driven by the states, right? States which sort of said that we will give women equal rights in the property, and this sort of happened in Kerala, Karnataka, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Andhra, and then eventually this union government in 2005 made it nationwide. So and that of course suffered from multiple years of uncertainty because of bad judgments this way and that. Finally, it was settled in 2021 that yes, this right relates to irrespective of when the father died, and unless an actual partition taken place. So in that context, there is almost little or no discussion on the reform of Hindu law, right? We all have great discussions on the reform of Islamic law, as if the people are talking about are Islamic scholars. They're not. It's mostly like, oh, how can they do this? We should stop it. There's a very little sense of like, listen, there are huge problematic parts of our Hindu code, and therefore we should try and figure out ways to make it better. But all of that is kind of diverted in this whole quest for a quote unquote UCC.